On today's show, my guest for today's podcast is Stanley Cohen. He is an attorney in New York who has spent a lifetime defending the individual from the state, and as a result has himself become an enemy of the state. Perhaps we can get into that a little bit today. Stanley, thank you so much for joining me on the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's great to speak with you. As I mentioned here in the opening, you've recently become a target for the federal government, and given your career as an attorney, I suppose you always were a potential target, but they've recently have decided to come after you. I'm not sure if that's something that you're able to get into at the moment, and I do want to talk to you about the PayPal 14 case, of course, and issues related to that case, but if you're able to and wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your activism and your career as an attorney and these charges that have been levied against you, I think it may provide some context for those in the audience who are not familiar with your body of work.
Well, sure. I spent the first almost 7 years of my life as a criminal defense attorney with the Legal Aid Society in the South Bronx in New York City, doing hundreds, thousands of cases of largely people of color in the South Bronx, which was then in the vernacular of fire, doing major cases, cop shooting cases, cop corruption cases, you name it, I did it. From there, and it's important to keep in mind that in my last life as a human being before I became an attorney,
Yeah.
I didn't go to law school until I was in my late 20s. I mean, I was, for years before then, I'd been involved in the anti-war movement, had been involved in community organizing, was a community organizer, was a social worker, ran a drug program, a street drug program, a street shelter, an anti-poverty agency, was a Vista volunteer who set up a legal services project with the American Indian movement in the Winnebago and Santee Sioux territories in Nebraska and South Dakota, was involved in a host of, very militant opposition strategies and actions against the government. So long before I went to law school, I didn't discover resistance or advocacy or fighting back in law school. It's just something that I sort of evolved into. Following my years at the Legal Aid Society, I went into a practice, spent a good chunk of it as a de facto law partner with Lynn Stewart, who herself was convicted on crap and bullshit, and eventually, recently, was released because of her health.
Yeah.
Home. Thrilled about that. Over the years as a defense attorney, I've represented everyone from the leader of Hamas to members and leaders of Hezbollah to members, and I'm currently about to start trial on the so-called Osama bin Laden's son-in-law case in the Southern District of New York. I have served as an advisor to political movements all over the world. I've sued Israel. I've sued the United States. I've challenged governments, individuals, and movements in the International Criminal Court. I've sued all over the world. I've probably defended more so-called terrorism cases, real and fake, all over the world in the United States than any other lawyer.
Yeah.
I've done enormous amounts of public speaking and organizing and advising over international issues. As I've said years ago, diplomacy is much too important to be left to the diplomats. I've been a very harsh and open and public and severe critic of the last 3, 4, 5 administrations, in particular, certainly the Bush administrations and the current administration under the kingship of Iva Drone. And, the investigation of me, we know, didn't recently begin. It began in the later days of the Bush administration. Mm-hmm. It started out as a so-called terrorism investigation because of my work with Hamas and as an attorney, as a legal advisor, and also work on behalf of resistance movements throughout the world. I've also represented the IRA and Shining Path and Los Mochateros and Independistas and Zapatistas and squatters in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and the homeless, and you name it, and I've been involved in it for many years. So what started out as a so-called terrorism investigation and went fucking nowhere, then shifted into a whole host of activities that also went nowhere. And when all else fails, it finds itself on the desk of the Internal Revenue Service. Mm-hmm. which, has made all sorts of wild, sweeping allegations. The only problem that they've made is they've ended up with a series of misdemeanor counts and a state offense, not even a federal offense under federal law. This has been going on for about 7 years now. And anyone who believes that I have not been targeted, that I have not been singled out, that I have not been added to the crosshairs of this administration or the last because of my politics, well, I've got a bridge to sell you. But my position with regard to, look, one of the great advocates in the history of this country, Clarence Darrow, said over 100 years ago, you show me a criminal defense attorney who spends his or her life defending the despaired, the despised, the powerless, the disaffected, who's never been charged themselves, and I'll show you someone with a failed career. So just the way Lynn was targeted and many others have been targeted and I've been targeted, it comes with the turf. If you're effective, if you're outspoken, if you challenge them, if you expose them, if you resist them, if you ignore them, if you take them on and embarrass them, they fucking come for you.
Indeed.
And it is what it is. So it'll go where it goes. It's been years. It hasn't slowed me down. It hasn't stopped me. It's caused tremendous stress and strain and resource problems. It's extraordinarily expensive to defend against the United States government. But, fuck them. What can I say?
I guess that's all that can be said, right? But no, so many good points you just raised, but interesting that talking about your life as a human being before an attorney, so often lawyers are the butt of a joke. They're the scum of the earth and this and that. But every now and then you find someone who's doing it right, and I suppose you're right. If you're doing it the right way, then all this sort of stuff is going to come with the territory. The target's going to be plainly painted on your back, and they're going to come after you, as they have with so many other people. And Lynn Stewart was a good example that you raised. I know you have a history with Lynn. You worked together at one point, I believe. You were law partners, and she was just released recently. I was talking to a friend of mine, Larry Pinkney, yesterday on my other show, Traces of Reality, and he was updating me on Lynn, on her release, and he was working as a spokesman on her behalf, getting outreach and getting people aware of the cause and calling for a compassionate release. And thankfully, that did come. So I guess every now and then there is some, a bit of good news to share. So no, but again, so many different things I wanted to talk to you about, but I'm glad that you were able to share a little bit about what's happening with you personally. And as you said, this is not the first time, so I'm sure you'll beat this just like every other time.
In 1990, I was indicted for seditious conspiracy in Canada as a result of my work at the standoff at Oka on behalf of the Mohawk Warrior Society. And, that took 2 years, and we won there. And there have been other occasions where I've been accused of crossing the line from, the classic criminal defense attorney to the advocate. And, they come for me, and I've beaten them then. And, look, you live, you fight, you die. You don't allow it to deter you. You don't allow it to take you away from what the nature of the struggle and the resistance is. And it goes where it goes. There are so many more people. I can't imagine how many friends of mine who have been assassinated, who have been murdered, whose families have been killed, who are imprisoned, who are detained throughout the world because of their politics and their beliefs. I am certainly not going to stand up and be any special or any different or feel that my need is more compelling.
Sure.
More of a surprise than tens of thousands of people throughout the world who have stood up, taken a righteous stand, and paid the price. So I'm prepared to fight these fuckers, and we will, and it'll go where it'll go. And meanwhile, I'm continuing to represent my clients. I've got a major terrorism case about to begin in a month. I've got a lawsuit pending against Israel in the International Criminal Court right now. I'm involved in taking the Egyptian government, the current military government, to the International Criminal Court. Just finished the 2.5-year PayPal 14 case.
Right.
I can go on and on and on. It still is what it is.
Exactly, and that's the case that I wanted to focus on today, if we can, the PayPal 14. And you mentioned, of course, your lifetime in activism before being a lawyer and even while being a lawyer, and. I want to get your perspective on this, because when I look at the scene, so to speak, of activism in the 21st century, it seems like you know, the most of the time what we're hearing about is happening in the digital realm within hacktivism. You know, there's still plenty of room, of course, for plain old, good old-fashioned on the streets activism, but it seems to be happening at least in combination with what's going on online. I want to get your opinion on this as we transition to the PayPal 14 case and what they did, what they were alleged to have done, what they ultimately admitted to doing, and you know, who they were, who they are. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. The PayPal 14 are heroes. I believe we are in good hands. I believe the next generation, whether it's Anonymous, whether it's Occupy, whether it's Black Bloc, whether it's anarchist movements, resistance movements throughout the country, I'm actually more optimistic about the state of the future with the tens of thousands, perhaps the millions of largely young women and men, but also many not so young women and men who have evolved into a dynamic, a living, a forceful, a determined check against endless government resources, endless government power, endless government abuse, endless government surveillance. The actions attributed to the PayPal 14, which they readily stood up eventually and said, yep, we did it, in our view was not a crime at all. In our view was protected First Amendment activity. In our view was a principled stance against a monolithic corporate effort to control the narrative, to control the discussion, to penalize whistleblowers and those who went out to speak the truth and to spread the message and to pierce the veil of government surveillance and security. Like the civil rights and freedom marchers of the 60s, these young women and men took a principled stand and understood going in that what they proposed to do and what they did constituted a breach of federal law. Nevertheless, they made a determined effort to make their voice loud, make their voice clear, to challenge the status quo, to refuse to go silently into the night, to be part of the discussion and the debate, and to serve as a message and to send a message to millions of similar folks throughout the world that they're not going to sit back passively while this administration and while the corporate greed of this country and this world controls the narrative. So they engaged in a DDoS activity. They eventually were prosecuted and charged with it. We fought it for 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years. And then after a very long time of negotiations, the group decided to reach a disposition. They stood up in court and they said, this is what we did do. This is why we did it. I don't think it's any secret. They didn't collaborate. They didn't cooperate. They didn't throw themselves on the ground and beg for mercy. PayPal went after them tough and hard and serious and with eBay and sought $5.5–6 million in damages. Well, they shouldn't hold their fucking breath. And they made a decision that after 2.5 years, the disposition was fair, it was appropriate, that they weren't going to cry and that they weren't going to, sell their souls to the people that put handcuffs on your wrists and try to silence your mouth and to steal your soul and your vision. And in the view of the PayPal 14 and the 30 some odd lawyers collectively that worked on it, the resolution was a great victory for them. The resolution was a great victory for civil disobedience. The resolution was a great victory for standing up to this conspiracy of silence. It was a great victory for standing up against this administration, which is trying to steal the life's blood, the life's breath of what we know and who we are and where we go, that is engaged in a determined effort to silence its critics by a variety of options that run from political persecutions to challenges in the court, to the threat of NDAA, to assassinations and murders overseas, and indeed at home, I would suspect.
Indeed. No, and there's doesn't need too much speculation to think of the ways that they've already targeted people within our own borders, let alone, in foreign countries. But we were just talking about COINTELPRO the other day and how it's still alive and well and how Occupy is still being infiltrated and people are going after them. There were plots discovered a year ago to take out Occupy leaders via sniper fire. We found within the Stratfor leaked emails, the global intelligence files, that they also were contracted on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security to go after Occupy and look into their activities. And I'm sure that's all happening online as well. I mean, it's obviously happening. We can look at the Jeremy Hammond case, for example, and examine the way the FBI was involved there. And so we can go on and on and on. There's so many different examples of this is happening today in 2014, and so many different things you mentioned deserve more attention. The NDAA, the assassination program, on and on and on and on. But I mean, thankfully there are people still that, as you said, will stand up to this, will not stay silent. The PayPal 14 were an example of that. And you represent Mercedes Hafer, I believe, one of the Anons that are collectively known as the PayPal 14. And as you mentioned, a plea deal was reached. And the consequences of that, each of the 14 or 13, I believe, are going to pay $5,000, a little over $5,000 in restitution. They were raising funds to pay this, blackmail or coercion, whatever you want to call it. They're paying this back. Has that goal been reached, Stanley? I haven't been able to keep up with that.
Unless a great enlightened liberal financier is out there and wants to write a check for $82,000, it's good. Look, it's going to be taken care of the way that everything else in the internet and the cyberspace movement is taken care of. By hard work, by little folks, by folks that work hard, that toil, that collect pennies, that struggle together, that resist against the government control. There's approximately a year between the plea and the date of sentence. We expect, hope, that by the time of sentence, the $82,000 in quote-unquote restitution, keeping in mind, PayPal or eBay, because you can't separate the two, they're both malignancies wedded at the hip, demanded $5.5 million. And $5.5 million at the end of 2.5 years came down to $82,000.
Could you explain to the audience where that number came from, that $5.5 million that eBay and PayPal claimed that these people originally owed them in damages? Well, how did they come up with that figure?
It's interesting because when PayPal and eBay apparently filed the SEC filings, and they're obligated to because they're a publicly held company, which had to do specifically with the DDoS attack, and because they're shareholders, they were asked, how much damage did you suffer? They said 0. So I don't know whether they lied to the SEC or whether they lied to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Subsequently, they had a press spokesman who stood up publicly and said, we weren't touched. We're invincible. We're a tiger tank. At the end of the day, what we were able to figure out is the following. Let me use a comparison, an analogy. If I get mad at my next door neighbor and I drive my car through the front door of his bodega and I break the front glass on his shop and it costs $237 to repair, and I get arrested for criminal mischief, and as part of a disposition, this guy turned around and said, well, I'm not going to have this again. So he decides to spend $6 million to build a 40-foot building made out of steel and brick, and hire 3,000 security guards to make sure that I can't drive my car through the window again, and then hands me the bill for $5.5 million. That's what PayPal did. That's what eBay did. They took the position that as a result of this DDoS activity, between modifications in their systems, between trying to figure out what had happened, between trying to figure out whatever happened couldn't happen again, between hiring investigators and doing research and doing changes, they absorbed $5.5 million. So it's very much the story of the pebble that breaks the window that then becomes a 14-story tower because the corporate giant doesn't want the pebble to break the window again. It's bullshit. It's exploitation, it's puffery, and it's criminal on their end.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And you mentioned earlier that you can't separate eBay from PayPal, and you can't separate eBay and PayPal from Pierre Omidyar. And I know you have some choice words about him as well. I wouldn't mind getting into that a little bit because you can't look up a story about the PayPal 14 lately without that tweet embedded into the story from Pierre, without some sort of caveat within the article. And I'm talking about like across the spectrum, from CNN to Fox to RT to Huffington Post. It doesn't matter where you look it up. If you look up a story about PayPal, within the story, they're going to embed the tweet or talk about Pierre Omidyar and talk about his call for leniency for the PayPal 14, as if he was, magnanimous Pierre came to the rescue at the tail end to come and save the PayPal 14 from the damages that they were claiming initially. So could you speak on this, Stanley, a little bit?
It's all disingenuous rubbish. I understand that that Pierre views himself as the hip or the cool or the counterculture Rupert Murdoch, but he's every fucking bit as despicable. He's every bit as all-controlling as Murdoch and every other not petty, but every other large communication network that's controlled the discussion and the narrative in this country for 100, 150 years, if not longer. The reality of it is, all of a sudden, Pierre started swooning about, be kind, be generous, be supportive, when two things really converged. Number one, we spent a long time seeking information from PayPal and from eBay over their losses. We got subpoenas that were granted to us. We were about to get information that Pierre and his folks did not want to turn over. So the notion that all of a sudden he woke up and became egalitarian because he really had concerns about people he had persecuted for 2 years is absolute bullshit. Number two, it was a foregone conclusion by the time that all of a sudden, he became born again and started speaking a week or two before the dispositions on where this was going. And it was a foregone conclusion because the U.S. attorneys notified PayPal, notified eBay, and said, this is the deal, this is where it's going, this is how it's going to end up. So all of a sudden the manipulator jumped in, all of a sudden the opportunist, Pierre, jumped in, because keep in mind, this is happening at around the same time that he's cooking up his next progressive arms, which is this, the super hip, this super cool cyberspace internet alternative to the New York fucking Times, the Daily News, or the New York Post. So it was all part of a propaganda and a PR ploy. The reality of it is, you can't separate the prosecution of PayPal 14 from eBay. You can't separate it from the chairman of the board. You can't separate it from those people who now want to merge with the force behind eBay to set up a new cool and hip and avant-garde and chic media outlet, which at the end of the day is just another multi-billion-dollar way to control the narrative and to control the discourse.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. And it did not seem like much of a coincidence to me. However, I think too many people out there have dismissed it as coincidence that this happened, as you just pointed out, that he came forward with that call, that tweet for leniency, just at the time that they're announcing and forging together that First Look media outlet, along with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Jeremy Scahill. And troubling, even I guess more troubling to me, or as at minimum equally as troubling, I should say, is the fact that now by joining forces with Greenwald and with Poitras, now they have access to this gigantic NSA trove and this ongoing story that seemingly never ends, right? And they're going to be churning out more as I guess as the media outlet develops. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, seeing as how, how much of this do you place, on Greenwald, on Poitras, on Scahill, and et cetera, are they just, in your mind, are they just looking for a way to, as they say, get the message out as broadly as possible, and if you have to take money from Pierre Omidyar, then so be it? Or, what else is happening here in your opinion?
Listen. We have been so under the gun, progressives, people that have resisted, folks that have fought back for so many years, that we tend to reach out for golden calves. So all of a sudden we have some, perhaps many at times, have reached out to those who seek to stage manage, those who seek to control the discussion and the narrative, those that seek to choose what gets released for our review and when, and we've turned them into these great titans of justice. Journalists are journalists. Writers are writers. It's not up to the most enlightened and progressive journalists, should they be in the world, to stage manage what we get and when and how best we can use it because I don't need another father or grandfather. We all have the ability to look at material, to draw our own conclusions. We don't need it doled out like a reward for our pups after dinner or for going and taking a good shit on the sidewalk. What we need when there's information, when people like Manning, when people like the PayPal 14, when folks like Julian Assange, and I've had my disagreements with him, and I'm sure he hasn't lost any sleep over it. When folks like that stand up and put their asses on the line that say we're going to release this information because it's information that is critical for the discussion, for the debate, for we folks on the ground to know and understand so that we can take control of our own destinies, it's not up to anyone to decide what we get and when we get it and how we get it. This 1% release is bullshit. We don't need fathers. We don't need those that are going to vet what we can read, when and how. If you're a journalist, if you've got the information, release it. Now, I've heard bullshit about how folks are trying to be sensitive to the needs of Mr. Snowden. Mm-hmm. I'm not looking to hurt Mr. Snowden. He is a dynamic, he is a wonderful, he is a brave fighter, very much the way that Ms. Manning and the PayPal 14 in Jeremy is. They're not his lawyer. They're not supposed to be his agent. They're not supposed to be his handler. It's one thing if he released certain information to them with the specific understanding and requirement that there was certain information he would not allow them to release. That's one thing. I understand that. That happens all the time. Journalists have to deal with that, and they have to make a good faith effort to uphold it. I don't understand that's what happened here. What I understand is they've made a call or a decision, like fucking Hollywood producers, like film writers and screenwriters, to control what and when we get and how. We don't need it. What are we going to be, 113 fucking years old and getting something released that shows what this administration has done? Or, on the other hand, are they holding on to some information that PayPal and eBay don't want out there because of their complicity with the NSA all these years? It stinks. These heroes, they're not I.F. Stone, they're not Clarence Darrow, they're not great human organizers, they're not Emma Goldman. They claim to be journalists. Get the stuff, you've got it, release it, let adults make the decisions we want to make. We don't need you to filter anything for us. If you want to do that, become Hollywood film writers and makers so that we know you're Michael fucking Moore. If you want to do that, go out and make a nice, lovely romance or a movie about Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in Afghanistan. We are talking about information that has cost the lives of who knows how many millions of people worldwide. When WikiLeaks stood up and released information, when Ms. Manning stood up and released information willy-nilly wholesale and is looking at a 35-year jail sentence, she didn't cut the line in the sand and say, oh, today a little pittance of information and tomorrow a little bit more. When PayPal did what they did, they didn't make decisions on behalf of others. I think it's bullshit. I think it's disingenuous. But I think part of the problem is those of us who look at people that represent, and I call it represent whistleblowers, and that seek to control the flow of information have built a cult of personality which furthers it and doesn't defeat it, and it's got to be stopped.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny that you mentioned a couple of times the idea of Greenwald, Poitras, Scahill, Omidyar, etc., functioning as Hollywood producers, because so much of this has played out like a Hollywood script. It's really quite bizarre when I reflect back on the way it's all sort of unfolded up to this point. It plays like a movie, and my second point on that note is the fact that, of course, they're pitching this as a movie. They're looking at movie deals currently. They're in a bidding war with Sony and with HBO and everyone else. So there's so many different things wrong with this. Fundamentally, I think you hit it right on the head, that this is the public's information after all. We deserve to have it, and it's not theirs to slowly dole out as rewards, as you said. That's number one. But then when you consider the connections with Omidyar, when you consider PayPal's affiliations and relationships with the NSA and that inherent conflict of interest there, when you consider the ways that they've profited from this with the movie deals, the book deals, and so forth, it really does raise alarm bells. And I'm frankly a little surprised don't know why I'm surprised, but I am surprised that they continually refuse to even acknowledge it. What conflict of interest? You're out of your fucking mind. You're crazy lunatics, conspiracy theorists. What are you talking about? There's nothing to see here. Move on. And they just sort of just slyly dismiss it without acknowledging the very basic fact that it is inherently a conflict of interest, and they refuse to do it. On your point about Snowden, though, that's what it comes back to ultimately, I found, because when you ask, because Greenwald's attempted to answer these questions as to why he's chosen to do this as he has, and releasing the leaks incrementally. He's given a host of different reasons, whether it's legal reasons, whether it's I'm protecting potentially the identities of people within these documents. Well, if that's true, then just redact the names and dump it. That doesn't matter. That's just the quick and easy solution for that. But it all comes back to, well, we have an agreement with Snowden, and we can't violate that agreement. And so that's usually the fallback. And once they come to that reasoning, then it's like, unquestionable that, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to respect, your agreement with your whistleblower and the fact that he wants it released in this way, which I still don't know if that's even true, but that's what they say.
Listen, I cannot believe that someone who stood up and said, this is what the NSA is about, this is what they do, this is how they control the narrative and the discourse, turned around and said to that crew, 1% is for the public and the rest we sit on. I don't believe that.
Or sell.
I think it's absolute bullshit.
Yeah. It's hard for me to believe also. And it's funny that, Snowden just recently released, as I guess his latest comments were that he's basically done, that his mission has been accomplished. And if that's true, then I don't see what's to stop, the complete release of all the documents, other than you still need to hold on to a chunk of that for your movie and for your book and for so forth. So I don't know. That's just my opinion on that so far. It's tough, as you said, when such few people have control over this information and this narrative, and they shouldn't. That's the bottom line. They really, really shouldn't. I wanted to get your thoughts on other comments within this same sort of discussion, because I read this in a blog piece, a quote that was attributed to you, and I don't even know if it's accurate or where it comes from or who you said it to, because it's within a blog that offered no citation. So unfortunately, I don't have it. But it was in relation to Glenn Greenwald and his comments on Jonathan Pollard. And he's not doing himself any favors. He's, we've already have questions about Greenwald with the whole Pierre thing, and now he's digging another hole for himself. But you said this: if you play Israel or support it, we have nothing to say. It is perverse in the extreme, or a palpably clear effort to endear oneself to a party line by suggesting there is any comparison between what Pollard did and why, and what Snowden did and why. He who cannot see the difference is blind or shilling 4 points. So, first of all, is that accurate? And could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Sure, it's accurate. I mean, there's a couple different things happening here. Number one, in case Mr. Greenwald has missed it somewhere along the line, I find it interesting. He's been singled out by the Zionists for a while because of his position. Some very nice and very easy and very soft positions. They're not difficult. It's not hard to stand up and say you're against homelessness. It's not hard to stand up and say Israel, with apartheid and occupation and ethnic cleansing and collective punishment is the bad guy. That's the easy stuff. But when you get to the next level, when you get into the relationships, when you get into who's doing what, why, when, and where, it becomes a little bit more difficult for folks. Now, yes, Mr. Greenwald has been singled out by the lunatic fringe crew of the Zionist movement and been called either an anti-Semite, interesting, or a self-hating Jew. I understand. And I assume, and congratulations if he's earned it, I hope he's worked hard, and I hope he wears the label proud. On the other hand, there is right now a worldwide boycott, divestiture, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, that simply says, and I've adhered to it for years and before the movement, we don't deal with Israel, we don't talk with Israel, we don't recognize it with Israel, we don't do business with Israel, we don't exchange ideas with Israel, end of story. When Israel becomes a member of the world community, when there's a binational state, or if Palestinians choose a two-state resolution based upon equality and justice and fairness and the right of return, and with Jerusalem as its capital, fine. Until then, it's not business as usual. So I had a number of problems with what Greenwald did. Number one, sitting down and giving an interview to an Israeli media outlet, direct interview, which was somewhat laudatory of Israel's position, violates BDS. It shouldn't have happened, and as I said, as a result of that, I got nothing to say with Greenwald. But even more so, you go to the next step. It is true, and some people have been critical of me, that he didn't go quite as far as to suggest that what Pollard did and what Snowden did was similar. But what clearly he discussed was quote unquote the whole role of state surveillance. And he essentially drew comparisons between the NSA state surveillance, which resulted in Snowden taking a principled stand to make sure the world was aware of what was going on, and he wanted to distinguish or see what was the difference between outing the NSA and the position that the NSA had taken with what Pollard had done. And he saw some sort of fundamental hypocrisy there, that while the U.S. was imprisoning, was jailing Pollard and had for decades, it was engaged in the same kind of activity, and it was double standard. Now, the reality of it is, comparing one to the other is comparing, the arsonist who starts the fire with the volunteer firefighter who goes to put it out. I mean, it's disingenuous in the extreme, but I'm sure it carried him some real points in Israel. I'm sure it sent a wink to the Israeli power elite and to the establishment that I'm not such a bad guy. To stand up there and to draw comparisons between what Pollard did for $500,000 worth of money, between the sale of intelligence information, which not only endangered the United States, but endangered large chunks of the world for the benefit of his Israeli paymaster, and to somehow draw comparisons with the relationship between NSA and Snowden is perverse. It's sick. It's disgusting. But it got some applause in Israel, and it supported the Free Pollard movement that he's a political prisoner. And so, look, you can take it where you want. I mean, ultimately, I've got nothing to say, and I basically, in a post, said I'm not going to talk about it, and here I am talking about it. Because as far as I'm concerned, when you cross the line, when you violate the BDS, it's over. There's nothing further to discuss.
Gotcha. And I suppose that, that wink and a nod over to Israel, I mean, I'm curious, how much of that was for himself and how much of that was for First Look Media. Building a new media outlet, I'm sure, would not be bad for them to have some brownie points in with, the Israel lobby. So I'm just, curious to get your thoughts on the state of media in general as you see it. Again, as we talked about before, just the consolidation of these gigantic media companies, and now with one, this new outlet with Greenwald, etc. And I think your description of it was pretty damn near perfect. As the new hip Rupert Murdoch, basically the next generation of hip Rupert Murdochs. But I mean, could you expand on those thoughts? Because I think it's so very important in this age, with the fact that we have so few media outlets online these days that provide truly independent sort of information. And the fact that they call First Look Media this new independent venture, they really stress that word. I suppose they're stressing it so much that they're almost redefining what the fucking word means, because it doesn't mean what I think it means anymore, I guess. But your thoughts on that, man?
I think it's great to be independent with $1 billion bankroll.
Yeah, right.
I think it's really a liberating notion to level the playing field by taking a fucking $1 billion, by being able to buy, to seduce, to take, to purchase all the electronic, all the cyberspace, all the internet means, to hire the best and the brightest, and to control the narrative. So for them to say that this is an independent media outlook or media network, which is funded by billions of fucking dollars, which is coming ultimately from PayPal and eBay, is an obscenity. It's a joke. It's ridiculous. I will take any day of the week 1,000 25-year-old bloggers or shows such as yours that are competing in the marketplace, because in the marketplace of truth, of discourse rather, the truth will always rise. This is not the establishment of this new media magnet, this titan, this new Murdoch you know, this new Murdoch empire, it doesn't free the debate. It doesn't unleash the discussion. It doesn't empower millions or tens of millions of people worldwide to gain access to information. The perfect example is the very people who are stage managing the release of the NSA information, that are standing there saying, we're going to decide what you get, when you get it, how you get it, and why you get it, put their other hat on and describe themselves as an independent free media network. That's like standing up in a courtroom and representing some young guy who's just murdered, allegedly, both of his parents, and asking the judge for mercy because he's a fucking orphan. I mean, it is such rubbish. I mean, and it's really so dismissive. It treats us like children.
Yeah.
Listen, the folks that are out there blogging, I may agree with them, I may disagree with them, their skills may not be so great, my skills may not be so great, but you know what? It's like the pamphleteer during the American Revolution. It's like the person in the revolution, the so-called Arab Spring, the people that get out there, that send their message, that voice their opinion, that I could accept, that you could reject, that I could reject. That's where we need to be. We don't need to be with narrowing the control of what we read, what we hear, and what we see. We're just coming through a generation where, for good measure, and it's a good result, the handful of super newspapers nationwide that control the discussion are going out of business. Thank fucking God. And that's a hell of a thing for an atheist to say. But thank God, because for all these years we've been victimized by their control of what we read, how and when and who, and they control the narrative. So having just gone over that hump and having now an opportunity to breathe at ease because we've got the internet, because we've got bloggers, because we've got independent folks putting their opinions out among billions of people, here comes the move to narrow it, to control it, to buy it and own it. And that's what this new conglomerate is about.
Exactly right, man. I completely agree. And in fact, we were just discussing that very same point that you just raised. Beautifully put, by the way, Stanley. But that's that very same point we raised a couple of days ago on the BFP Roundtable show, which will be out, I believe, pretty soon. If not today, then tomorrow. But the idea that the dinosaur media is nearing its extinction, the newspaper press is all but dead. Of course, they've transitioned into the internet, and that's sort of the point. They're finding a way to maintain their control over these narratives by shifting their attention into these new media platforms and building their own and branding them as independent, branding them as alternative. You can trust us. We're not the mainstream. We just got billions of dollars in our bank accounts, and we're funded by giant corporations, but we're alternative. We're independent. Just trust us. And it's very disturbing for someone like me, who's, I mean, I'm and not to sound bitter, but I'm barely getting by. We're doing this solely, completely subsidized by the people. That's the way this operation funds itself. Donations from people is the way that we are able to do this, and that to me is what I consider independence. So when I hear someone like a Greenwald, like a Pierre, like a Scahill, etc., use the word independent in this way, it really fucking bothers me, and maybe to the point where it shouldn't. I should probably just let it roll off my back, but it does get to me, and it's good to hear you articulate your thoughts on this, because I think you did I think you summed it up very, very well. I really don't really have much more to say on top of that, because that pretty much sums it up. But Stanley, it's been great to talk to you, and I suppose we should probably leave it at that. But I do want to give you a chance here to give just share your final thoughts here with the audience before we close out the program today. Again, I very, very much appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. But anything you'd like to leave the audience here with, please do mention, of course, where people can read your stuff, follow your work, and follow what you do online.
Well, I mean, there's iStanleyCohen.org, which is a website, although we haven't updated it for a while, which has a running commentary on some of my statements and what I've written and the cases I'm handling, what's going on with my own struggle, photo travels, journeys, new cases. That's iStanleyCohen.org. But, look, I tweet a lot, I speak a lot, I travel a lot, I'm out there. So feel free to jump in, to talk to me, to reach out to me. But in terms of a final parting word, I'd like to say to your audience that I'd like to end the show where I began. I think the future is solid. I think it's strong. I think we're in better shape than we have been for decades. And I think it's primarily because of stations and groups and blogs and ideas and internet folks like yourself and millions of other young women and men out there who have decided they're not going to sit back and take it anymore. I hate to use that old line.
Sure.
That they are going to play an active role in their world, in their future, that they are going to play an active role in resistance, in standing up and making sure that information gets out so that we can make informed decisions about our lives, about how we see the future, about what we're willing to accept, and most of all, about what we're willing not to accept, no matter what the cost. And I think with that, times are good, the future's good, there's some difficult, dark days ahead, but I feel like, I've been fighting for, 40, 45 years, and someone recently said to me, my God, after all these years, do you believe the thing's going down around you? And I've said, well, I'm in one of those valleys right now, but I really see the emergence of lots and lots and lots of determined resistance, people who are willing to stand up, to pay the price, to take the chance, to pay the price again if whatever happens, happens, because they do understand that this is their world, this is your world, and we can't go silently into the night.
Indeed. No, well said, sir. And I do share in that same optimism despite the difficulties as we've been talking about today. So I wanted to echo that sentiment 100%. It is in our hands. We can do something about it. And I guess that's ultimately, and I know it's perhaps, as you said, a bit cliche to use these phrases, but that's ultimately what it boils down to, is for folks out there to realize that you do have the potential and you do have the power to do this. So let's get over that learned helplessness that's been drilled into our heads. Again, Stanley, I really appreciate you coming on the program, sharing your thoughts with our audience today. Check out Stanley's work on istanleycohen.org. A big thanks to you for being here. A big thanks to those of you listening who support the show and support BFB through your donations and your subscriptions. I really cannot thank you enough. Come back and join us next week right here on Demanufacturing Consent on BoilingFrogsPost.com. And until then, this has been your host, Guillermo Jimenez, reminding you, as always, that on this grand chessboard, it is we, the people, who are now in check. It's our move. Thank you all for listening.